If you're like me, then one of the most puzzling verses in the entire Hebrew scriptures is Genesis 1:26. It says something that has caused debate amongst Jews and Christians for thousands of years. It says, "Let us make man in our image." Seemingly harmless comment, but in truth what we discover is us. Who's the us? Who's God talking to? Could he be talking to angels, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, something else? So that's what we're going to discuss in this video. This verse, I'm going to look at it from a Jewish point of view, obviously, but I'm also going to try to consider the Christian point of view as I'm going through it, because I feel like when we engage in talking with Christians about this sort of thing, we have to be clear on what our objection is. Some of these interpretations just don't work. If what you're trying to accomplish is you want to have a better means of understanding the text yourself. Commentaries is, of course, a good way to learn quickly, but it's not a good way to learn deeply. And the best way to learn deeply is for you to approach the text, try to understand it for yourself, and then move on to the commentaries. So that's what we'll do. And so what I'm going to focus on is not Midrashic interpretations, Kabbalistic interpretations. Right? I'm not looking for hints and puzzles, and I'm looking for the peshat, plain meaning of the text. For a long time, I think like most Jews, the answer to the question of who the us is angels. And the reason I believe this was because Rashi's commentary said so. I had no reason to doubt that. Rashi's a great rabbi. I once asked a rabbi when I was learning in yeshiva, I said, "How come we can't disagree with Rashi?" And the rabbi laughed and he says, "You can disagree with Rashi, you just have to know what you're talking about." That is true. So what I'm going to look at is not to disagree with Rashi, to say that Rashi's explanation is not the one that I'm looking for. Because I'm not looking for a midrashic explanation, I'm looking for peshat's plain meaning understanding of the text. One of the interesting things that happens here in Genesis 1:26 is that when we look at 1:27, which rarely happens, I think, in conversations about this, is that there is a switch that happens between 1:26 and 1:27. Actually, there are two switches. The first switch is, it says at the beginning, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Verse 27, however, it says, "God created man in his image." We went from verse 26, us, more than one person, or more than one thing, or to 27, only God. The second switch is that in verse 26, Adam is singular. "Let us make man in our image." But in verse 27, Adam's plural. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God created man, but Ha'adam is actually male and female. Adam is one. Ha'adam is male and female. Now, I'm not saying that phraseology is something that's consistent throughout the text. I'm just pointing out there is also that switch as well, is that it goes from Adam to Ha'adam. And the ha is a definite article. So we won't get into that. That's something we can talk about in a different video. So we have these two switches, from plural to singular with the one who created man, and man from singular to plural. Notice, isn't it interesting that we have a switch? One is let us make, and there's let's make this one thing or one being. And then in verse 2 is God made, one being made Ha'adam, this male and female entity. I think that's kind of interesting. So what I think I can draw, the conclusion I can draw actually from this switch, is that what the Torah is trying to tell us is that even though let us make, there was this us that God was talking to in a different way than we think. Traditionally, I think we looked at this as being a active collaboration between God and someone else, possibly, if you're a Christian, another member of the Godhead. And if you're a Jew, like me, then I think perhaps it was a concept, perhaps angels, perhaps something else. 27 is telling us, no, only God created. So I would say that part of this explanation, and we're going to deal with this more in part 2, I believe, is that let us make and God created. I think the verbs there, the creation verbs we'll call them, are two different with two different meanings. Make has the idea that there's something already there and that you're going to make it. Just like we see later on that God formed the man from the earth. So there's something there that you're going to make the man from. Whereas verse 27 uses the word bara. Bara appears at the beginning of the Torah when God says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bara means, as we standardly understand it, as I think Jews and Christians have this in common. I think we all understand that when God says he created, he's talking about ex nihilo, from nothing. There was nothing there. God created everything. We agree that bara has this idea of creating from nothing. I would say that make and bara, na'aseh, which is make, and bara, he created, are two very important distinctions. If we look at it from that point, what we're being told, the switch here is telling us that the us is involved in the making of man, but he's not involved in the creation of man. That distinction then means that God is the active member of the us. Only God actively creates man. And that makes the other member likely to be a passive participant in some way. That's where we are with this. What I want to say now is that I think that naturally we have to move on next to, can angels, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, can those three, is it possible they can count as passive members of this project of creating man? Let's start with angels. We do know that angels do form courts. The matter is by the decree of the angels, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whomever he will, and sets up over in the lowest of men. And that's Daniel 4:14. So we can understand the angels from that standpoint. This is an active body that exists. It could be, with a little stretch, we could say that God consults with them. And so in that way, they could be a passive member of this let us make man. Rashi says, the verse does not refrain from teaching proper conduct and the virtue of humbleness, namely, that the greater should consult and take permission from the smaller. For had it been written, I shall make a man, we could not then have learned that he spoke to his judicial council, but to himself. That's his commentary on 126. Rashi himself here is explaining to us that this is a teaching. That this is a teaching of proper conduct and a virtue of humbleness. And that's what a midrash is. Oftentimes, it's an allegory that teaches some sort of moral quality. And again, that's something that's very useful to us, but it's not something that is relevant to us when we're looking for the plain meaning of the text. Well, what about Jesus and the Holy Spirit? Can we use this? Can we say that Jesus and the Holy Spirit could act as a passive participants in the creation of man? Well, this is a little hard to talk about, and the reason why is because the first thing you have to understand how the Trinity works. And the problem with that is that oftentimes somebody will get up and say, this is what the Trinity is, and this is how it works. And then after you finish giving their explanation, another person stands up and says, no, you've got it all wrong. This is the Trinity, and this is how it works, right? So this is a difficulty. The most basic understanding I have of the Trinity, and you can agree or disagree, but this is my understanding of the Trinity, is there are three persons in the Trinity, and they share one being. That means that externally, they're one, internally, they are plural. That's how I understand the Trinity. That's how I'm going to use it as I talk about it here. If I've gotten it majorly wrong, you're free to explain it to me. But if you're going to explain it to me, be clear, because I would really like, if I'm wrong, to hear a better, clearer explanation. If Jesus is God, because he shares God's being, and God is sort of a collective term, and the Holy Spirit is God for the same reason, God the Father is God for the same reason, then all three of these entities share the same being. So despite their personhood, if you will, the one thing that you conclude is they are God. So when God says, let us make man in our image, that is the voice of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That means that there is no other. The question of who us is has not been solved. Because if God is truly one, and these persons dwell within that oneness of being, then we still need a partner in the process of creating man. Who is that other? Or what is that other? We also have another problem, and that is, and this is true for all three of the proposed people that we've suggested, angels, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. They all have the same problem, and that is none of them are actually mentioned in the text. So we have two problems. Problem number 1 for the Jewish answer angels is that's midrashic, and we're looking at peshat. We want to know the plain meaning of the text. Problem number 1 for the Christians is that if God is truly one, if God is externally singular, one, but internally plural, then that means that he cannot be both members of the us. This cannot be an internal dialogue amongst the Trinity, because the us has to be somebody else, because God's one. They share the same being. The second problem that all three share in common is they're not directly mentioned in the text. I know there are Christians who will say, they'll point back to Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit of God hovers over the deep. Frankly, that's a little bit ambiguous. We can talk about that on another time. But it doesn't resolve the problem. Because even if you want to insist on that, insist that because it's the Spirit of God is there in Genesis chapter 1, then I refer you back to the first problem. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one being. And so when it says, God says, let us make man in our image, he's saying God, which is the Trinity, says let us. That means the Trinity plus somebody else. Here I'm going to close it out. And this is what I want to say, is that in the video we excluded the possibility that God's partners could be angels, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. So what are we going to talk about in part 2? That's actually, we're going to consider the problem of the two creation accounts. There's a creation account in chapter 1 of Genesis and a creation account in chapter 2 of Genesis, and we're going to talk about those things because they have a huge impact on this question of who the us is that created man. So I hope you found this informative, and I can't wait to see you next time. If you enjoyed this, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, hit your like button, and you know what? Send me a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'll talk to you later.